There is a gorgeous full moon out there. Oh, wait. Oh, I'm supposed to play the teaser? Damn it.
The more experience I get and the older I get and the more I'm working in the media industry, I realize how many people are at the top and how many people are thriving and how many people are in power who actually are mediocre and who actually should have imposter syndrome and they don't.
Well, how's it going, CNFers? This is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. I'm your host and producer and everything, Brendan O'Mara. How's it going? Hey, it's always a pleasure when past guests come back on the show. And it's the pleasure of pleasures when that person is Alexandra DiPalma. That was episode 130. This is episode 239. So if you do the math and solve for X, that equals to a wicked lot of episodes over 2 years. Someone tweeted at the time of that first episode that listening to my conversation with Alex the first time around was like listening to two people becoming great friends in real time. I thought that was really cool and summed it up perfectly. And Alex and I really feel that way. There are some people I just click with, like, you know, that when a magnet sticks to a refrigerator. It's just that, you know, whap. You know, I'd put Bronwyn Dickey in that category, Elizabeth Rush, Bryn Jonathan Butler, and of course Alex. With the exception of Elizabeth, I've never physically met these people, and I just feel such a kinship with them. You know, many others as well, that's for sure. But, you know, these four just come to the top of my mind as people that just, you have that kind of thing. The guitar is in tune, man. Anyway, Alex is back because she's the ringleader of the Podcast Workshop, formerly the Podcast Fellowship. It's the Podcast Workshop now. It's one of the Akimbo workshops pioneered by the one and only Seth Godin. By heading over to BrendanO'Mara.com, you'll find show notes to this episode and others, but this particular episode, you'll get a link that grants you this early bird discount if you want to start a podcast and work with Alex and the other coaches and, of course, your entire cohort with the Akimbo workshop of the Podcast Workshop. If I were starting over, I'd start with the Podcast Workshop for sure. These Akimbo workshops are just so great. You become a different person from day one to whenever it ends. Even just a couple of years ago, this isn't Akimbo related, but it's Alex related. You know, a couple of years ago, I had a pretty good footing in what it takes to produce a weekly podcast. You know that, a podcast of this nature, and I took Alex's Creative Live class, and that's a Chase Jarvis brainchild, if you will, and he's been on the show. You might recall when his book Creative Calling came out about a little over a year ago. But her Creative Live class, I learned so much about being more efficient as a producer. Like, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. So the way she broke a lot of that down definitely helped me with my workflow when it comes to editing, booking guests, packaging a show, the nitty-gritty that if it's done well, you never hear it at all. I attribute a lot of that to Alex and her skill, having come up as a classically trained sort of radiophile and, you know, coming through school as podcasts were on the rise. Point being, if you're thinking about a podcast, you can follow Alex's lead if you want to really find your voice. She's the founder of Domino Sound. That's dominosound.co is the website for her company. It's a podcast production company, and it's not unlike what we're doing here at Exit 3 Media. And it was working with Seth that gave her the confidence that she could start her own company. And gangbusters. She's taking over the world, man. It's good stuff. As long as people like her are taking over the world, you know, I will gladly follow her lead. I'll have more to say at the end of the show, my parting shot. But in the meantime, make sure you're all subscribed up to this thing that we do. You can always say what up on social media at CNF Pod or at Brendan O'Mara across the big three. And, lock into this conversation with Alex. I first started by asking her, it's something I should have asked her the first time when I learned how she came to be working with Seth. But I started this off by asking her quite literally what it was like, having won the lottery by being handed Seth's podcast when she was working at Midroll a few years ago. That, of course, turned into something special. And so here's the infinitely wonderful Alexandra DiPalma.
That way completely almost every day. Meeting Seth and kind of learning with him and having him as a mentor, first of all, it's just been personally so gratifying and I've learned so much. But in addition to that, honestly, when you really kind of get down to logistics, being able to teach the podcasting workshop with Seth, which we'll talk about in a second, we're having it's the 7th version of the podcast fellowship. The 7th workshop is awesome. Starting on February 1st, 2021. But doing that allowed me to quit my job and start my own company. And so winning the lottery is a perfect way to put it, because it was kind of like meeting Seth and collaborating with Seth. And we started this workshop together, and it ended up being a side project that ended up kind of being a main project, and then allowing me to literally start the company that I now have called Domino Sound. And so every single day I think of how insane that is exactly how you put it. I was working at the company Midroll. I got assigned to Seth's podcast Akimbo, and then we met and completely, from day one, we completely hit it off, and I knew that we would be collaborators, but I didn't quite realize that it would have such a huge impact on my life and my career, and even not just career, personal life. When I'm sad or when I have things going on, I talk to Seth. And so it's just been, like you said, hitting the lottery, but also so much better than that, because I know that it's kind of like a lifelong relationship that I'm just going to continue to learn from. It's really special.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, I was lucky enough. I got to talk to him in August about his about the practice, and it was we recorded way ahead of his pub date, and then it pubbed in November, so that's when I ran it. It was just I was freaking out just because I hold him in such high regard, and it's just he's so generous, and he's one of those people where he lives up to his reputation when you speak to him. And
absolutely. Matter of fact, in one of the podcasts I produced called Food for Thought, we were just talking, they're all writers, and we had a conversation about what happens when you meet your heroes. Because in a lot of cases, writers have literary heroes. Yeah. And in so many cases, it's kind of their advice at the end of the conversation was don't try and meet your heroes because you're going to be let down. But you're totally right. I think in Seth's case, he more than lives up to the reputation.
So when you were developing the podcast fellowship, or I think it's a workshop now, is that what you're calling it?
Now, yes.
So what was the process by which that unfolded, and just how did you storyboard the workshop, so to speak?
It's so funny that we're having this conversation, because this is something now at the launch of number 7 of this workshop I've been thinking a lot about and kind of looking back at, because it really was Seth approached me with the idea, and I think I might have mentioned it in the first podcast interview that we did, but he had a family friend who was a young woman who was in college, and she called Seth to ask advice about getting an internship for the summer. And she was I think she was talking, one of those kinds of internships where really you're getting coffee and printing things. And Seth said, well, why don't you start a podcast, and you can talk to kind of the people in your field that you'd be interested in talking to. So essentially she said, I would love to start a podcast, but I need something that's a little more structured. I need something that I can get a certificate at the end. You know what I mean? Something more official. And so in that sense, that right after that conversation, Seth called me and said, why don't we start a class teaching podcasting? And I immediately said yes, and didn't exactly think of the logistics behind it until after agreeing to do it. And really, of course, I went to school for podcasting. I studied journalism and radio, but I had never taught podcasting. And so there was probably a 2-week period after I agreed to do it with Seth. And then I think I was, do you know when you're just spinning in your own mind? And it was not at all
Yeah.
that I was putting it off, but I was sitting there every single day at my desk being like, how am I going to approach this? Like, what am I like? Where do I begin? You know what I mean? And Seth, of course, being Seth called me after 2 weeks of kind of not hearing from me and was like, I have a feeling that you're spinning. Like, I have a feeling that you don't know where to begin. And I was like, that's so crazy because that's exactly the situation that I'm in right now. I really just don't know, like I said, where to begin. And he really, I don't exactly know that. I don't know if it's necessarily that he gave me words of advice as much as like he kind of called me out. You know what I mean? It was kind of like an accountability moment where he was like, listen, like, you know how to do this. Like I approached you to do this because I know that you're capable of doing this. And from there, it really just went, it's so funny. I remember I was on a family vacation with my family in Portugal. And I was just so stressed out about coming up with this class. And so, but in a good way, it was a really exciting challenge. But the thing that I hadn't realized, I think, was taking a step back from like, I assume as somebody, you too, you as well, obviously, like you're somebody who produces podcasts. It's hard to kind of step back and remember what it's like when you had no idea how to do anything. You know what I mean? Like starting from square one. And so the process for me was really trying to like erase all of the knowledge I had in a way and going back to being the person that I was before I knew anything about podcasting, before I picked up a mic, before I edited any audio. And that's how the storyboarding went. I ended up coming up with like 35 lessons. It's a 7-week course. And it starts at, it really starts at developing the concept for your podcast. So like absolute step one, like what are you interested in? What would you feel like talking about? Then it goes on to, recording your voice. And then we get into audio editing. Then we get into publishing. But the process was like a really interesting for me, kind of like unwrapping of the knowledge of podcast production, because you have to go back to step one. And so I learned a lot along the way. And I think, like I said, after 7 iterations of this course, it's held up remarkably well. I'm shocked at how remarkably well it's held up, because I kind of expected we would have to do a lot of tweaks and a lot of changes, but those original 35 lessons, pretty much, we have made tweaks, re-recorded some episodes of the podcast, but it's still how it is today.
Did you find that once you locked into what that sort of first critical lesson was, that was, to kind of borrow a term from your company, that was a lead domino, and then everything else kind of opened up from there?
That's a very good way to put it. Yes, that's exactly how it was. It was so once, and it's probably the same. I'm not exactly a writer, aspiring writer perhaps, but I think probably with writers, when it's like the whole thing is, it's just like writing the first sentence, writing stuff, getting something on the page is the hardest part. And that's exactly what it was. Like once I finally just got started, and that's such a lesson of Seth's as well. Like, just do it. You know what I mean? Just not necessarily. And he always says that there's a difference between shipping the work and not caring about it versus like doing your best and not worrying about whether it's perfect. And so that's kind of where I had been, I was like, these lessons aren't perfect. How am I going to make this perfect? And then finally, when I was like, let me just get something down on the page, that's when everything started flowing. And so that exactly like you said, that has definitely been, I think, a lesson for other work going forward as well, where it was like, just get started and then figure out the rest from there.
And over the course of developing the workshop and the lessons, and then of course your experience as a producer on mic, behind mic, where are you most excited in that continuum of the production process?
I really actually like, and I'm so grateful that I'm getting to do more of this now, the development process. So the process where I'm working with talent, new voices, people who have never done podcasts before. I actually love working with people who are podcasters as well, because it's kind of easier. But I like the process of working to develop the show. So that's like starting from the seed of an idea and really going through the process of making a pilot, making another version of the pilot. And in a lot of cases with Domino, we'll do, 5 iterations of episode 1 before we settle on a format, before we settle on exactly what the tone is going to be and everything like that. And so I think that development process for me has turned out to be, I guess, the most fun and the most like creatively rewarding. I think it can be tough because there are a lot of cases in that process where you think like it's like version 3 of the pilot and it's just not working, and you're like, oh my God, what, I've been wasting all this time. This just isn't working. And then finally something clicks. And so I really like the development process. And for a while I was doing less of that because I was also doing a lot of editing, like actual audio editing. And so I think I've been fortunate in building Domino, being able to do more of the like executive production work, where it's kind of like more overseeing rather than the nitty gritty. And that's the part I've been really into so far.
What would you identify is the great allure of becoming or starting a podcast? And you can probably piggyback that off a lot of the people who attend the workshops.
Seth made me think of this in a new way, because I've always just been one of the rare people, and this is not neither good nor bad, but I started my career in podcasting like as my career, like I was making money on podcasting from the beginning rather than having it be a hobby. And so I was kind of coming into it like thinking that it was something that people sought as a career. You know what I mean? Like, this is something you're going to work in radio, you're going to work in podcasting, and that's going to be your career. And Seth, while we developed the workshop, actually compared it more to blogging. And I hadn't thought of it in that sense, like where it's something that an individual can do in order to build a body of work, in order to make connections, in order to really and this is the thing that always surprises me in the workshop, like hone different skills that aren't completely related to the act of podcasting. And so in the sense of like, as an example, somebody after they graduated from the class or, graduated, after they completed the course, talked about how becoming a podcaster had helped them with their communication skills outside of podcasting. Like after doing the interviews and after going through the exercises of how to become a good interviewer, they realized that most of their interactions and most of their conversations, they were not even listening to the people. They were just talking the whole time. And so I think the allure is really how Seth frames it, is kind of finding your own voice, building this body of work that you can share with people. And it doesn't have to be, and again, we always emphasize this, and I think you and I have talked about this, Brendan, but you don't have to have Joe Rogan numbers for your podcast to be a success. You know what I mean? Like your podcast could be a success because you're talking to the people that you want to talk to, because you have had the conversations that you're learning from. And you have, as I said, like, I think it is really important, and Seth talks about this a lot, to have that body of work that you can share with people that's more than a resume. You know what I mean? Like it is something when you share your podcast with somebody and you talk about all these people that you've interviewed, it's impressive in a lot of ways. And I think that it's accessible to everybody, much in the way that blogging is. But I think that that's really a big allure.
What would you identify as maybe some peeves that you have come across in terms of, just because you have an ear for it, so peeves or, maybe common mistakes that people are making as they get into this?
Do you know what's so funny? One of my friends who has a podcast called LGBTQIA, his name is Jeffrey Masters. He just had a little Twitter thread on this yesterday. And I just found myself doing it like 5 minutes ago when you asked me a question. And one of his peeves, which I actually agree with, is when a guest says, "Oh, that was such a good question," when people don't cut it, because it's such a natural thing. Like, I think even me, when I'm on a podcast, I'll say that like 5 different times. I'll be like, "Oh, great question," and then go into my answer. And with if you don't cut it, it's just kind of like, okay, you're being a little self-congratulatory. You know what I mean? Like that, I think that's one of them when I hear, "Oh, that's such a good question," that people keep in the interview, even though I have done that before. I only have decided to cut that from my interviews after reading Jeffrey's thread yesterday. So that's one. I think another one, my main pet peeve really is probably, and we try to kind of account for this in the podcast workshop, when people do the thing when they're just like, "I want to have a podcast where I talk about everything." You know what I
Oh
mean?
yeah.
When
Hmm.
they're like, me and my friend have these really interesting conversations. And so like every week we're going to meet up and like just talk about like art, culture, sex, dating, like everything, work, you know what I'm saying? And so I think it's really hard for me when people approach me about podcasts or potentially having a podcast and they haven't really honed in on a focus, or especially when they haven't honed in on what would make their podcast different. And that's not to say something that we talk about in the workshop a lot is like, you don't have to making your podcast is going to be different because you host it. You know what I mean? Like, it's like
Yeah.
you being you is the actual thing that differentiates it. So lean into the things that make you unique rather than doing the thing where it's just like, I'm just going to have these generic conversations about everything. So for me, I really like podcasts that have a specific focus. Like my friend just started a podcast, and like it's just one of these examples of something that is so outrageously specific that you could only do it in a podcast. It's called Celebrity Book Club,
Hmm.
and they read celebrity memoirs and then talk about them. It's like only celebrity memoirs, and that's the only thing that they discuss on the show. And it's like it's just so specific, but it really works because they end up talking. You know, they have their own personalities and they're comedians, so they talk about all sorts of different things. But the focus and the kind of like pitch is every week we're going to talk about a new celebrity memoir. And so I just love the specificity.
What fraction would you say of podcast workshop members over the 6 iterations and now the seventh are people who want to be solely on mic, and then maybe versus
Mm.
people who want to actually maybe produce and maybe be more behind the scenes?
Hmm. I think in the podcast workshop, we found the vast majority of the people are interested in being behind the mic. And I think that's really on it. Like, there have definitely been a few people who will join the course with like a partner, like somebody who would be the host and then they'll be the producer, which I think is a really great way to do it. But I think for the most part, just because it streamlines the process, like it's hard, it's another barrier to have to find a host if you're getting into podcasting. You know what I mean? And so it's like it's kind of hard to join as a producer if you don't have a host already attached. But I have seen people in the workshop go through the workshop, do a podcast where they are the host on the microphone, and then they get into production. And like I actually there are a few people from the workshop who now are like freelance podcast producers, and they do it for hire. And so there's a fair amount of people who have gone through the process and done it and then decided to be a producer, kind of like what I did.
One thing that always strikes me when talking to people who want to get into podcasting
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, yeah, it's like if you start a blog,
Mm-hmm.
there's no you're never going to delude yourself into making money off your blog.
Right.
But for some reason, podcasting, people think it's like this, like an ATM just waiting to draw money out of, and it's just not the case.
Right.
How do you dispel that myth that getting into podcasting is just can be a cash cow?
Well, I think Seth does it really well in the course because literally I think it's coming out tomorrow, but his podcast, we run an ad on his podcast when the workshop is coming up. And the first thing he says in the ad advertising the workshop is, please do not take this course if you're trying to make money off podcasting. Like,
Great.
because you're not going to. You know what I mean? And there have been people who have proven us wrong. There have been people who have actually kind of parlayed their podcast into money making endeavors. But the way that we really dispel it is by just telling people that that's not realistic. You know what I mean? And I think like it's actually really interesting you say this because just last night I was watching a trailer for something on HBO called, I think it was called Fake Famous, and it's a new documentary that's coming out. And apparently, I haven't fact checked this stat, but the majority, like the thing that young people in the U.S. cite that they want to be when they grow up the most is a professional influencer. And like the whole point of the documentary is basically like the percentage of people who are going to be influencers and making a living on Instagram is just like so incredibly low that it's not even a realistic goal that you could ever have. You know what I mean? It's like you cannot like go into your teen years and be like, I want to be an influencer for my career. And that's kind of how I feel like it is with podcasting. Like it seems like it's super easy. It seems like all you need to do is like get a mic and record something and then you'll be making money and you'll be a podcaster. But as you know, that's not how it is. And so we just like to be upfront with people about that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's just when you see the charts on iTunes, it's you see these things, they're very, very polished, and
Right.
oftentimes everything on the charts tends to be one and two
Mm-hmm.
of things. There's usually there's a celebrity behind it, so there's
Mm-hmm.
already a baked in audience,
Mm-hmm.
or there's a media company behind it, whether
Yep.
that's NPR or New York Times,
Yep.
and so they have an institutional heft and thrust
Exactly.
behind it that can position it in such a way with a baked in audience
Right.
that makes these things really, they just so popular. And then when you
Right.
measure yourself up against that, you're just setting yourself up to fail.
Right. Well, I'm curious, you've been doing how many years have you been doing your podcast?
Let's see. I'm entering year 9
That is
soon, and
unbelievable. You're like the original podcaster. So for you, like I can't I mean, for you, making a podcasting your living.
it is not my living. I
Uh-huh.
can occasionally get a little bit of scratch, but
Uh-huh.
it's certainly not a living.
Right.
That's for
So how like what has kept you doing it for 9 years?
Let's see. Okay, so there were a couple iterations. So I started it, and it wasn't super, super consistent for
Mm-hmm.
maybe like the first 3 to 4. It was very sporadic, and I wonder,
Mm-hmm.
why isn't the audience growing?
Right.
And so at the end of 2016, so right at the beginning of 2017, I vowed just show up every single week,
Mm-hmm.
and I've maybe missed 1 week in four
Wow.
and a half years or whatever.
That's
And
amazing.
as a result of showing up, lo and behold, like Seth would say, drip by drip,
Mm-hmm.
it's grown, and it's by no means, conquering the world, but it's doing its little thing. It's very specific, and
Mm-hmm.
it serves a very, very small niche audience, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of what you want to do.
Yes.
But what keeps me coming back to your question is this idea of building community
Mm-hmm.
and celebrating people's work, being a cheerleader for people's work.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, it stemmed from a lot of toxic feelings of resentment and jealousy that I was
Hmm.
feeling as a freelancer when I
Yeah.
first started, comparing myself to others and wondering why I wasn't on people's
Right.
podcast. Not that I was doing anything to merit that kind of attention, but I was feeling like this, just all these toxic feelings. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe this is the time where you can channel it and have the conversations you wish people were inviting you to have,
Yeah.
and be the leader of those conversations. And then by celebrating people's work through the toxicity, and over the course of the years, and just finding a voice and developing a kind of a style that serves the audience and the
Uh-huh.
guest, and also works through a lot of the things I want to work through. It has engendered a sense of a partnership with the
Mm-hmm.
audience. And I have too many books to read, and it's great to be able to have the headliners of the festival, like I say, like those big A-list writers,
Uh-huh.
and then emerging talent, and maybe people who are just not, they have books, but who the hell has heard of this person, and
Mm-hmm.
get them on too. So it's a good mix, and it's kind of building community. Ultimately,
Wow.
that's what keeps me coming back to it, is building that community and being having, being the hub of the wheel.
Yeah. I mean, I love that answer. Everything that you said, I mean, we should put that when you said what's the allure of starting a podcast, your answer is honestly so much better than mine. Like I not that it's a competition, obviously, but I think what I failed to mention really that you touched on was the building community aspect, which I think is really the most important aspect of it. And I kind of love what you said about, yeah, like it was something that you were feeling resentful about and then you kind of took it into your own hands. And I think that's what I mean when we compare it to the blogging, is like it's within your power, it's within your reach to do that. Like anyone can start a podcast. And I think those reasons are those, it's like a really beautiful reason, the building community.
But yeah, and like, I think, to the point of, we talked about how it's not a good way to make money.
Mm.
um how do you get people thinking in terms of, beyond, thousands and thousands of downloads,
Mhm.
and having Squarespace sponsor your show,
Right.
thinking beyond those metrics that we're bombarded with the really popular podcasts?
Yeah. I mean, really, I think we talk a lot. I talk a lot about this, not only in the workshop, but in the work that I do at Domino Sound. Like we are a professional podcast company. Like we produce podcasts with HBO. We're producing a podcast with TED right now. And we also produce Domino Originals. And so Domino Originals are kind of, you can think of them as more of like the indie podcasts. And so we produce those podcasts with really like the full expectation that we probably won't be making a ton of money from them. We produce them with one of them. Actually, I have to plug it because it's just such an entertaining show. It's called The Cheat Code. It's from Domino Sound. It's a podcast told over 10 episodes, the story of an affair, a marriage, a relationship. It's actually very deep, but it's also very funny and entertaining. And so one of the things that kind of this was a long-term goal, but we were surprised that it happened so fast. Like it's now being developed for television. So that's like a really exciting thing that we didn't anticipate. But awesome. Backing up, even the talent that we work with at Domino and Domino Originals, like we tell them, you are not going to directly make money from this podcast. Like this is going to be something that and I think this really goes back to the answer that I gave before. Like this is an opportunity for you to build your work and to build your voice and to build really kind of like your reputation in a way, like for instance, we have another podcast we have is called The Color Grade. And it's a podcast that's really highlights Black critics and their reviews of films, mostly created by Black directors, Black filmmakers, Black actors. And again, super specific. That's a podcast that, like you said about your podcast, has a really niche audience. But for the host, we have a second. We worked with one host season 1 and another host named KB this season. Both Joy and KB are excellent. But we told them, this podcast isn't going to make you money, but it is going to give you opportunities. You're going to be able to get press passes to festivals. You're going to be able to be featured on different radio shows because now you have a podcast. Like it's kind of, I think the way that I sell it to people is this is a way to parlay your podcast into other opportunities because now you've built credibility. You have this body of work that gives you credibility, and now you're kind of like an expert in whatever your podcast is. And so that's what I've seen most of my talent really do is get other opportunities via the podcast.
So from operational standpoint, when you're, courting talent with the idea that you're, giving them a platform to develop this skill, are you then, seeking, sponsorship to help afford the production and keep the lights on for you? And is that how you get paid essentially when you're producing a show for other talent?
Honestly, even for us, like another show that I just mentioned, Food for Thought, that show has 50,000 downloads an episode, which I actually just saw a chart from, I think it was from Axios. It was a chart that ran down like the percentile of podcasts and their downloads. And if you have 40 to 50,000 downloads per episode, you are in the top 1 to 2% of podcasts. Now, we cannot for the life of us, we make fine money off that podcast, but there's 5 of us involved and none, it's like really a drop in the bucket. Like we're not making a ton of money from that podcast. So even at Domino, we're not making a ton of money from advertisers and sponsorships. What we're doing from an operational standpoint, like you said, we take on like branded podcasts or bigger production projects, like where we are hired as the producer in order to, that's really how we kind of like make our money from those production deals where we are the producers. And then we use that money, like, to pay ourselves, but also to kind of pay for the production of these indie podcasts, these Domino Originals that we really believe in, that we can't necessarily like get a big company behind because they're so niche. But like I said, like the bet on that, for instance, the one I told you about, the cheat code, like the bet on that is that we will be able to parlay those into other potentially unforeseen opportunities, like the TV show. You know what I mean? Like a TV show, like a book deal. We have a parenting podcast. We like are in talks about writing a book for that. Like the other speaking opportunities because of this parenting podcast. Like it's really, it's hard because it is, even as I say it right now, it sounds so like unpredictable. You know what I mean? Like, let's make this whole podcast and like hope that something comes from it. But so far it's actually been working. And so that's how we do it from an operational standpoint, is kind of like take on these projects that not that we're not passionate about all the projects we take on at Domino somehow align with our ethos in some way or another. But we'll take on a project with US Bank, for instance, and that will like fund 3
Yeah.
of our original podcasts.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's a lot of what I'm doing as well. It's like
Yeah.
you go to these brands that want to tell better stories,
Yeah.
and they have a lot of money, and
Yeah.
you can charge them a very fair rate, and they'll pay for it, and that can
Exactly.
subsidize, say, the journalism I want to do, or a lot of the journalism you want to do, those kind of stories.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the thing, and you're always, you're following your taste. I'm the same
Yeah.
way. Like, I'm not gonna produce a show for anyone who doesn't align with
Yeah.
my values. I'm gonna believe in whatever they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that, that we align in that way too. I think
Yeah.
that's where you have to have like a good compass to go on to
Definitely.
do these things.
And I think for us, like, I think for you and I, like, what I've noticed over the past few years is that there are so many more opportunities for that. Like, so many more opportunities for people who are now finally recognizing that producing a professional podcast costs money. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
people, like 4 years ago, people might approach me and ask me to do like 10 episodes for $1,000 or something. You know what I mean? Something
Mm,
crazy. And
yeah.
now, at least I find even people, first of all, don't even approach me with those kinds of ridiculous offers anymore. But they also finally are starting to understand that it's valuable and what it takes. And I also think like it's really interesting, like for instance, you said it's not necessarily just like the huge Squarespace companies that are now paying money for podcasts. There are really a lot of like smaller institutions, independent people who are willing to pay money. And like, so it's not necessarily like I think there's a lot of opportunities for freelancers to be producing different levels of podcasts. You know what I mean? And so I think that's really cool too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I love I love that after, once you started partnering with Seth, that the it gave you the fuel to then spur off and found
Yeah.
Domino Sound. So what was that inflection point and that feeling in that moment when you
Mm.
were able to take that leap?
I think it was more of one of those moments. And so you're a freelancer. I'm curious to hear from you as well. Like, I guess I went to college, I went to graduate school, I worked in public radio, and then I worked at a big podcast company. So I always essentially had kind of a 9 to 5. Like, I was never a type of person where I was like, like you hear on those podcasts, like I'm an entrepreneur. I knew from day one, like I wanted to start my own business and work for myself. Like that wasn't my experience. And so I think through working with Seth, it really just gave me more perspective on the fact that like you don't have to be that kind of person in order to start a company and work for yourself. Like this doesn't have to be something where it's like you've been planning your entire life to start your own company and like that's what you want to do. Like it gave me more perspective on the fact that kind of like really anyone can do it. You know what I mean? And I think when I got that perspective through working with Seth, I would go to my regular 9 to 5 job where I was working for someone and think to myself, like, but I could be doing this independently. You know what I mean? Like I could be working directly with these brands or with these people or with these clients and making this podcast, which I'm already doing, but underneath a company. And so the process was kind of like, I guess, demystifying entrepreneurship in a way, like demystifying the fact that you don't need to be this special kind of person. And honestly, Seth talks about it with in terms of being a creative. Like he's running something called the Creatives Workshop right now. And the whole ethos behind that is like there is such this sense of you're born as a creative. Like you are born to do this and like this is what you have in your DNA. But being a creative too is something that you can learn and it's a skill that you can develop. And so once I realized that, like that, I guess it kind of gave me like the freedom to feel like I could just quit my job and start my own thing, which hadn't even really crossed my mind prior to that. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. How did you wrestle with those feelings of being an imposter when you
Mm.
started? Being an entrepreneur. It's very
Yeah,
fancy and highfalutin. So
right.
how did you wrestle with that?
I think it was kind of like I definitely dealt with imposter syndrome. I still do. But I think it was kind of more the understanding that I was never presenting myself as something that I didn't feel like I was. You know what I mean? Like even when I started the company, like I would talk about what we're talking about now. Like this is something brand new to me. I don't know how to run a company. I'm not a business person. I don't blah blah blah. Like I think I was always very honest with myself and with others about that. And so it never felt like I was trying to like live up to something that I had like put out there that wasn't real. It was kind of more, I guess, just like really just I think it was kind of just staying present. Like, you know what I mean? Like day by day, just being like, I guess I have my own company now. I guess this is what it means to do this. And so it was and also I have to say, this might sound a little jaded or something, but like the more experience I get and the older I get and the more I'm working in the media industry, I realize how many people are at the top and how many people are thriving and how many people are in power who actually are mediocre and who actually should have imposter syndrome and they don't. And I sit there and I'm kind of like, if these people are like making their way to the top and they really don't have anything special that I think they're bringing to the table, like, why should I have imposter syndrome? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and I think it was the realization, like, so many of these people, I'm sorry, but they're mediocre. You know what I mean? And yet they have presented themselves in a way that they're not. And so that I think realizing that kind of gave me the confidence to shake off my own imposter syndrome.
Oh, that's great. And I guess kind of closing the circle.
Yeah.
So as you're approaching, this next iteration of the podcast workshop,
Yeah.
where is the juice lying for you? What's exciting
Mm.
you about this going forward?
I think I have to borrow your answer again. I love the building community aspect. And I don't, you've never been, you're such a professional, you don't need the podcasting workshop. So you've never been in it, but like, it's just such a place where you log into the forum is called Discourse. You basically, there's a really strong sense of community. And I think also, in addition to myself and Seth, there's a whole team of just like incredible coaches that we have. And these people are people that I've been working with over the past 7 iterations of the podcast workshop. And so I've really built a community with them as well, like with the team that I work with. And I love just like logging in and watching people sort through their own questions, their own issues, and kind of overcome them and really like be on this journey to becoming a podcaster. And it's just so incredible over the course of 7 weeks, like watching people actually achieve it. Like after 7 weeks, people literally have podcast episodes published on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And like, it's just I think the idea of like facilitating that and being part of that and witnessing it is where the juice lies for me every time.
That's amazing. Do
Yeah.
you have them host with like Anchor because it's free and that populates really easy to?
I actually the hosting the hosting is always a question because things change so much with hosting. Originally, I always recommended Simplecast, which I used to use a lot. But now I think it's like people use Anchor. It's kind of like we usually present hosting options and people kind of choose what fits for them. But mostly like I think Simplecast, Anchor, Podbean, stuff like that.
Yeah, this podcast I have
Yeah.
on Libsyn. I have
Okay.
another
Yeah.
little podcast called Casualty of Words, which is
Uh-huh.
a writing podcast for people in a hurry. So
Oh,
episodes, it's just
right
me
on.
on mic, less than 3 minutes long,
Wow.
and I have that. I'm just messing around with Anchor on
Yeah.
that, and that one's pretty. It's pretty wild because they automatically like get it into all the directories really easy. It's
Okay.
free.
So you
Since
recommend it?
I do right
Okay.
now. The analytics are okay, and
Okay.
since Spotify purchased them, um, if you just publish on Spotify, you get to use any music on Spotify.
Oh my God, that's right. That's a
So
new
there's
thing.
that whole thing, and then they
That's great. That's
actually
huge. That's really huge.
and you have the option too, like they will, put sponsors in front of you and you can I do a little ad read that's just for Anchor at the beginning. And whenever that podcast hits like 1,000, I'll get like $15 or whatever.
Really?
And it's just like they do that for you. It's actually really so it's been a fun experiment because I had it on
Okay.
SoundCloud and I kicked it over to Anchor because I was just curious because
Right.
someone was courting me on Anchor to take creative nonfiction podcast to
Right.
Anchor. And I was a little gun shy because I wasn't sure if they're giving it away for free. It's like,
Yeah,
what are
yeah,
you
yeah,
giving
yeah.
up?
Exactly.
And so I didn't do that, but I was like, you know what? Casualty of Words is so low stakes. I'll
Right.
just kick it over there and see what
Wow.
happens. And
I'm
it's
intrigued.
it's easy to navigate and you can edit within it, but I do everything in Hindenburg. So
Right.
and then I kick over the MP3 to it. So it's pretty
Okay.
wild. I don't know.
Check it out.
I'll report back
Please
after
do. Yes, please do.
more time.
But that's a good tip.
But Alex, my goodness, what a pleasure to speak to
I
you again.
know.
And best of luck with the podcast workshop and
Thank you
Domino
so much.
Sound. So we'll have to do this again, hopefully more frequently than every 2 years.
I know. It was so good to talk to you, Brendan. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great stuff, am I right? Always great stuff. I'm really locked into that. I like to say I'm in the pocket with some of these and not scrambling around like a fool. Go check out akimbo.com/podcast workshop. Let me double check that while I'm here. / the podcast workshop. akimbo.com/the podcast workshop. Got it? You can learn more about the show there, see a video from Seth, and if you use the link that's in the show notes to this episode, you'll unlock a discount. I'm not sure how long that will be valid, so the sooner the better. Go check it out. I took the marketing seminar, last year, I think at the end of 2019 and a good chunk of 2020. And though my wife seems to think I learned nothing from it, that's categorically false. I apply many of the lessons I learned from that Akimbo workshop, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily result in like thousands of more subscribers. And then when I say that, she looks at me like I'm kind of a loser, and well, she's partly right. Thanks to Alex. Check out dominosound.co to learn more about the workshop she's developing. Take her Creative Live course and definitely consider the Akimbo workshop. That's what she's here to do. She's on the 7th iteration of that. It's just getting better and better. And I can't recommend what they do at Akimbo enough. And if Alex is leading one of those workshops, you better believe it's going to be good. And it's work. They do put the work in workshop. You are in contact with other people who also want to level up. The vibe is unmatched. You'll be a different person at the end, I promise you. Your DNA will actually fundamentally change. Science. Okay, people. Got to start seeing some essays come in for the summer issue of the audio magazine. It's going to publish on the first day of summer. The theme is summer. The deadline is the first day of spring-ish, March 21st. You've got less than 2 months to get your essays to me. 2,000 words max. Theme is summer. Hit me with it. I've hired a local spoken word poet to write 3 summer poems. It's going to be kind of sprinkled out through the episode. It's going to be something special, something different from the first issue in isolation. That one, it was getting my feet on some solid ground, shipping something that was very proud of, very, very proud of the writers and what we were able to put together. It wasn't perfect, but I love it. And I'm taking a lot of what I learned from that and making the next one even better, and so forth. And that's how the ratchet turns. But we need to see it. Need to see some more essays come in. And of course, Patreon. Patreon.com/CNFpod. That's how you'll get exclusive access to the magazine for 75 cents per interview. Why is it that low? Well, there's a 5th one coming per month for next year. I'll talk about that another time, but you'll see. Oh, you'll see. The intro tier at just $4 a month, and that equates to like 75 cents an episode. You get transcripts, exclusive access to the magazines. Other tiers get you coaching and phone calls and more attention. And then there's the 1K MFA, tier 4, where you get really what I think is the equivalent of an MFA in 1 year for a savings of about $19,000. It's a pretty good deal. Will make you a better writer, a writer who is armed to go out and make art, make money, and push your boundaries and feel that tension of what it means to step outside your comfort zones. Maybe you've been writing personal essays, but, I would then, push you, let's do some reported work. Do some more journalistic stuff. and you'll find that the rigor of being a reporter or a journalist is going to really imbue the personal stuff with a lot more heft. You're going to have a heavier fastball. Only 5 slots available for that. It'll be good stuff, I'm telling you. I don't need to tell you. Maybe I do. Anyway, I don't have anything terribly insightful to share, but if you have something you'd like to say, I'd love to hear from you. Email the show, creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com or brendan@brendanomero.com. Your choice. I check them both frequently. Twitter, IG, @CNFpod, @BrendanOmera. If you leave a review on Apple Podcasts, I'll post a screenshot of that on Twitter and everywhere and give you some love in the only way I know how, by showering you with the almighty riff. Stay cool, CNFers. Stay cool forever. See ya.